The Darkest Evening of the Year by Dean Koontz. This book scares me. Like, it freaks me out a lot. I mean, it's not like horror gory, but it's just, it's like cruelty, and that it's human, I don't know, that it's scarier to me, human cruelty, than like a gory Dean Koontz one or a more horror one. But anyway, the first chapter of it, though, is something that I wanted to record to keep in mind as a reminder of the rule of like count to 10 when you're angry, like in Surviving Evidence, from the book that I got for Joe O, like ex-boyfriend Joe, that I got autographed for him when we met the author people at the thing, but I haven't given it back to him yet because I haven't finished reading it. Anyway, Darkest Evening of the Year. Part 1 starts with a quote. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep." Robert Frost. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Chapter 1. Behind the wheel of the Ford Explorer, Amy Redwing drove as if she were immortal and therefore safe at any speed. In the fitful breeze, a funnel of golden sycamore leaves spun along the post-midnight street. She blasted through them, crisp autumn scratching across the windshield. For some, the past is a chain, each day a link, raveling backward to one ringbolt or another, in one dark place or another, and tomorrow is a slave to yesterday. Amy Redwing did not know her origins. Abandoned at the age of 2, she had no memory of her mother and father. She had been left in a church, her name pinned to her shirt. A nun had found her sleeping on a pew. Most likely her surname had been invented to mislead. The police had failed to trace it to anyone. Redwing suggested a Native American heritage. Raven hair and dark eyes argued Cherokee, but her ancestors might as likely have come from Armenia or Sicily or Spain. Amy's history remained incomplete, but the lack of roots did not set her free. She was chained to some ringbolt set in the stone of a distant year. Although she presented herself as such a blithe spirit that she appeared to be capable of flight, she was in fact as earthbound as anyone. Belted to the passenger seat, feet pressed against a phantom brake pedal, Brian McCarthy wanted to urge Amy to slow down. He said nothing, however, because he was afraid that she would look away from the street to reply to his call for caution. Besides, when she was launched upon a mission like this, any plea for prudence might perversely incite her to stand harder on the accelerator. "I love October," she said, looking away from the street. "Don't you love October?" "This is still September. I can love October and September. September doesn't care." "Watch where you're going." "I love San Francisco, but it's hundreds of miles away." "The way you're driving will be there in 10 minutes. "I'm a superb driver. No accidents, no traffic citations." He said, "My entire life keeps flashing before my eyes." "You should make an appointment with an ophthalmologist." "Amy, please, don't keep looking at me." "You look fine, sweetie. Bad hair becomes you." "I mean, watch the road." "This guy named Marco, he's fine, but he drives a car." "Marco who?" "Marco something. He's in the Philippines. I read about him in a magazine." "Nobody blind can drive a car." "I suppose you don't believe we actually sent men to the moon." "I don't believe they drove there." "Marco's dog sits in the passenger seat. Marco senses from the dog when to turn right or left, when to hit the brakes." Some people thought Amy was a charming airhead. Initially, Brian had thought so too. Then he had realized he was wrong. He would never have fallen in love with an airhead. He said, "You aren't seriously telling me that seeing eye dogs can drive?" "The dog doesn't drive, silly. He just guides Marco." "What bizarro magazine were you reading?" "National Geographic." It was such an uplifting story about the human-dog bond, the empowerment of the disabled. I'll bet my left foot it wasn't National Geographic. I'm opposed to gambling, she said, but not to blind men driving. Well, they need to be responsible blind men. No place in the world, he insisted, allows the blind to drive. Not anymore, she agreed. Brian did not want to ask, could not prevent himself from asking. Marco wasn't allowed to drive anymore. He kept banging into things. Imagine that. But you can't blame Antoine. Antoine who? Antoine the dog. I'm sure he did his best. Dogs always do. Margaret just second-guessed him once too often. Watch where you're going. Left curve ahead. Smiling at him, she said, I'm my own Antoine. You'll never let me bang into things. In the salt-pale moonlight, an older middle-class neighborhood of one-story ranch houses seemed to effloresce out of the darkness. No street lamps brightened the night, but the moon silvered the leaves and the creamy trunks of eucalyptuses. Here and there, stucco walls had a faint ectoplasmic glow, as if this were a ghost town of phantom buildings inhabited by spirits. In the second block, lights brightened windows at one house. Amy braked to a full stop in the street, and the headlights flared off the reflective numbers on the curbside mailbox. She shifted the Expedition into reverse. Backing into the driveway, she said, in an iffy situation, you want to be aimed out for the fastest exit. As she killed the lights and the engine, Brian said, Iffy? Iffy like how? Getting out of the SUV, she said, with a crazy drunk guy, you just never know. Joining her at the back of the vehicle, where she put up the tailgate, Brian glanced at the house and said, so there's a crazy guy in there and he's drunk? On the phone, this Janet Brockman said her husband, Carl, he's crazy drunk, which probably means he's crazy from drinking. Amy started toward the house, and Brian gripped her shoulder, halting her. What if he's crazy when he's sober, and now it's worse because he's drunk? I'm not a psychiatrist, sweetie. Maybe this is police business. Police don't have time for crazy drunk guys like this. I think crazy drunk guys are right down their alley. Shrugging off his hand, heading toward the house once more, she said, we can't waste time, he's violent. Brian hurried after her. He's crazy drunk and violent? He probably won't be violent with me. Climbing steps to a porch, Brian said, what about me? I think he's only violent with their dog. But if this girl does want to take a whack at me, that's okay, because I have you. Me? I'm an architect. Not tonight, sweetie. Tonight you're muscle. Brian had accompanied her on other missions like this, but never previously after midnight to the home of a crazy violent drunk. What if I have a testosterone deficiency? Just pause, side note. I have this book, like I've had a copy of it forever. I might have, like I decreased my library a lot. I got rid of a bunch of my books just to like, sometimes I just have to clean up my library because I tend to, like, at points in my life I've had like hundreds and hundreds of books in my room, and my dad from time to time would make me like throw out a portion of it so that my entire room didn't fill up entirely with books. So I might have thrown it out. I didn't want to look through my 2 book bins for it. So this I borrowed from archive.org. It's like an online library. I don't know how legit it is. I have I've borrowed a lot of books from it. Some of them look like they've been like edited strangely, or maybe like different editions. I don't know, but this it's as I remember it so far. So anyway, archive.org. Enough side note. Do you have a testosterone deficiency? I cried reading that book last week. That book makes everyone cry. It just proves you're human. As Amy reached for the bell push, the door opened. A young woman with a bruised mouth and a bleeding lip appeared at the threshold. Ms. Redwing, she asked. You must be Janet. I wish I wasn't. I wish I was you, or anybody, somebody. Stepping back from the door, she invited them inside. Don't let Carl cripple her. He won't, Amy assured the woman. Janet blotted her lips with a bloody cloth. He crippled Maisie. Mouth plugged with a thumb, a pale girl of about 4 clung to a twisted fistful of the tail of Janet's blouse, as if anticipating a sudden cyclone that would try to spin her away from her mother. The living room was gray. A blue sofa, blue armchairs stood on a gold carpet, but a pair of lamps shed light as lusterless as ashes, and the colors were muted as though settled smoke from a long-quenched fire had laid a patina on them. If purgatory had formal parlors for the waiting multitudes, they might be as ordered and cheerless as this room. Crippled Maisie, Janet repeated. 4 months later, She glanced down at her daughter. 4 months later, Maisie died. Having begun to close the front door, Brian hesitated. He left it half open to the mild September night. "Where's your dog?" Amy asked. "In the kitchen." Janet put a hand to her swollen lip and spoke between her fingers. "With him." The child was too old to be sucking her thumb with such devotion, but this habit of the crib disturbed Brian less than did the character of her stare. A purple shade of blue, her eyes were wide with expectation and appeared to be bruised by experience. The air thickened as it does under thunderheads and a pending deluge. "Which way to the kitchen?" Amy asked. Janet led them through an archway into a hall flanked by dark rooms like flooded grottos. Her daughter glided at her side, as firmly attached as a remora to a larger fish. The hall was shadowy except at the far end, where a thin wedge of light stabbed in from a room beyond. The shadows seemed to ebb and flow and ebb again, but this phantom movement was only Brian's strong pulse, his vision throbbing in time with his laboring heart. At the midpoint of the hallway, a boy leaned with his forehead against a wall, his hands fisted at his temples. He was perhaps 6 years old. Side note, in my Costa Rica short story that I wrote, the quote unquote mean is some pitbull bitch, Nikki. I'll take her, no one, end quote. That dog was named after Nikki from this book, but she's not mean. Nikki is not mean. Nikki's a really, really good dog, and Nikki's friends with a little boy. End of little side note. At the midpoint of the hallway, a boy leaned with his forehead against a wall, his hands fisted at his temples. He was perhaps 6 years old. From him came the thinnest sound of misery, like air escaping molecule by molecule from the pinched neck of a balloon. Janet said, "It'll be okay, Jimmy." But when she put a hand on the boy's shoulder, he wrenched away from her. Trailed by her daughter, she proceeded to the end of the hall and pushed the door open, and the stiletto of light became a broadsword. Entering the kitchen behind the two women and the girl, Brian could almost have believed that the source of the light was the golden retriever sitting alertly in the corner between the cooktop and the refrigerator. The dog seemed to shine. She was neither pure blonde nor the coppery hue of some retrievers, but clothed in many shades of gold and radiant. Her undercoat was thick, her chest deep, her head beautifully formed. More compelling than the dog's appearance were her posture and attitude. She sat erect, head lifted, alertness signified by a slight raising of her pendant ears and by the ceaseless subtle flare and quiver of her nostrils. She didn't turn her head, but she shifted her eyes toward Amy and Brian, and at once refocused on Carl. The man of the house was at the moment something less than a man, or perhaps he was only what any man eventually might become when guided by no hand but his own. When sober, he probably had a neighborly face, or at least one of those faces that, seen by the thousands in city streets, is a bland mask of benign indifference, with lips compressed and eyes fixed on a distant nothing. Now, as he stood beside the kitchen table, his face was full of character, though of the wrong kind. His eyes were watery with drink and blood, and he looked out from under a lowered brow like a bull that sees on every side the challenge of a red cape. His jaw hung slack. His lips were cracked, perhaps from the chronic dehydration that afflicts an alcoholic. Carl Brockman turned his gaze on Brian. In those eyes shone not the mindless aggression of a man made stupid by drink, but instead the malevolent glee of a chained brute who had been liberated by it. To his wife, in a voice thick with bitterness, he said, "What have you done?" "Nothing, Carl. I just called them about the dog." His face was a snarl of knotted threats. "You must want some." Janet shook her head. "You must really want some, Jan. You do this, you know it's going to get you only one thing." As though embarrassed by the evidence of her submissiveness, Janet covered her bleeding mouth with one hand. Crouching, Amy called to the dog, "Here, cutie, come here, girl." On the table stood a bottle of tequila, a glass, a salt shaker in the shape of a white Scottish terrier, and a plate holding slices of a fresh lime. Raising his right hand from his side and high above his head, Carl revealed a tire iron. He gripped it by the pry end. When he slammed the tool down hard upon the table, slices of lime leaped from the plate. The bottle of tequila wobbled, and ice rattled in the glass. My throat is dry. Need water. Janet cringed. The little girl stopped to cry with her thumb. Brian winced and tensed, but Amy just continued to coax the retriever to come to her. The dog was neither startled nor made fearful by the crash of iron on wood. With a backhand swing of the tool, Carl swept everything off the table. At the farther end of the kitchen, tequila splashed, glass shattered, and the ceramic Scotty scattered salt across the floor. "Get out," crowed the man, "and get out of my house." Amy said, "The dog's a problem. You don't need a problem dog. We'll take her off your hands." "Who the hell are you anyway? She's my dog. She's not yours. I know how to handle the bitch." The table was not between them and Carl. If he lurched forward and swung the tire iron, they might be able to dodge a blow, only if the tequila made him slow and clumsy. The guy didn't look slow and clumsy. He seemed to be a bullet in the barrel, and any wrong word they made or wrong word they spoke might be the firing pin that sent him hurtling toward them. Turning his malevolent gaze upon his wife, Carl repeated, "I know how to handle the bitch." "All I did," Janet said meekly, "was give the poor thing a bath." "She didn't need a bath." Pleading her case, but careful not to argue it, Janet said, "Carl, honey, she was filthy. Her coat was all matted." "She's a dog, you stupid skink. She belongs in the yard." "I know, you're right. You don't want her in the house. But I was afraid, afraid she'd get those sores like she did before." Her conciliatory tone inflamed his anger instead of quenching it. "Nikki's my dog. I bought her. I own her. She's mine." He pointed the tire iron at his wife. "I know it's mine, and I keep what's mine. Nobody tells me what to do with anything that's mine." At the start of Carl's rant, Amy rose from her crouch and stood staring at him, rigid and still and moon-eyed. Brian saw something strange in her face, an expression he could not name. She was transfixed, but not by fear. Pointing the tire iron at Amy now instead of at his wife, Carl said, "What are you staring at? What are you even doing here, you dumb bitch? I told you, get out." Brian put both hands on a dinette chair. It wasn't much of a weapon, but with it he might be able to block the tire iron. "Sir, I'll pay you for the dog," Amy said. "You deaf?" "I'll buy her. Not for sale. $1,000. She's mine. 1,500. Familiar with Amy's finances, Brian said, "Amy?" Carl transferred the tire iron from his right hand to his left. He flexed his free hand as if he had been gripping the tool with such ferocity that his fingers had cramped. To Brian, he said, "Who the hell are you?" "I'm her architect." 1,500, Amy repeated. Although the kitchen was not too warm, Carl's face glistened with a thin film of greasy perspiration. His undershirt was damp. This was a drunkard's sweat, the body struggling to purge toxins. "I don't need your money." "Yes, sir, I know, but you don't need the dog either. She's not the only dog in the world. 1,700. What are you, crazy?" "Yeah, I am. But it's a good crazy. Like I'm not a suicide bomber or anything." "Suicide bomber?" "I don't have bodies buried in my backyard. Well, only one, but it's a canary in a shoebox." "Something's wrong with you," Carl said thickly. His name was Leroy. I didn't want a canary, especially not one named Leroy. A friend died. Leroy had nowhere to go. He had nothing but a shabby little cage, so I took him in, and he lived with me, and then I buried him. Though I didn't bury him until he was dead, because, like I said, I'm not that kind of crazy. Under his brow, Carl's eyes were deep wells with foul water glistening darkly at the bottom. Don't mock me. I wouldn't, sir. I can't. I was pretty much raised by nuns. I don't mock. Don't take God's name in vain. Don't wear patent leather shoes with a skirt. And I have such an enlarged guilt gland that it weighs as much as my brain. 1800. As Carl transferred the tire iron from his left hand to his right, he turned it end for end, now gripping it by the lug socket. He pointed the pry end, the sharp end, at Amy, but said nothing. Brian didn't know if the wife-beater silence was a good sign or a bad one. More than once he'd seen Amy talk an angry dog out of a snarl into a belly rub, but he would have betted his last dollar that Carl wouldn't get him to lie on his back and put all four in the air. 2,000, Amy said. That's as much as I have. I can't go any higher. Carl took a step toward her. Back off, Brian warned, raising the dinette chair as if he were a lion tamer, although a lion tamer would also have had a whip. To Brian, Amy said, take it easy, Frank Lloyd Wright. This gentleman and me, we're building some trust here. Carl extended his right arm, resting the tip of the pry bar in the recess between her collarbones, the blade against her throat. As though unaware that the point of a deadly weapon was poised to puncture her esophagus, Amy said, so, 2,000. You're a tough negotiator, sir. I won't be eating filet mignon for a while. That's okay. I'm more of a hamburger kind of girl anyway. The wife-beater was a chimera now, only part angry bull, part coiled serpent. His gaze was sharp with sinister calculation, and although his tongue was not forked, it slipped between his lips to test the air. Amy said, I knew this guy. He almost choked to death in a chunk of steak. The Heimlich maneuver wouldn't dislodge it, so a doctor cut his throat open there in the restaurant, fished the blockage out. As still as stone, the dog remained alert, and Brian wondered if he should take his lead from her. If the bottle of violence in Carl was about to be uncorked, surely Nicky would sense it first. This woman at a nearby table, Amy continued. She was so horrified she passed out face down in her lobster bisque. I don't think you can drown in a bowl of lobster bisque. It might even be good for the complexion, but I lifted her head out of it anyway. Carl licked his cracked lips. You must think I'm stupid. You might be ignorant, Amy said. I don't know you well enough to say, but I'm totally sure you're not stupid. Brian realized he was grinding his teeth. You give me a check for 2,000, Carl said. You'll stop payment on it 10 minutes after you're at the door with the dog. I don't intend to give you a check. From an inside jacket pocket, she withdrew a wad of folded $100 bills held together by a blue and yellow butterfly barrette. I'll pay cash. Brian was no longer grinding his teeth. His mouth had fallen open. Lowering the tire iron to his side, Carla said, Something's for sure wrong with you. She pocketed the barrette, fanned the $100 bills, and said, Deal? He put the weapon on the table, took the money, and counted it with the deliberateness of a man whose memory of math had been bleached pale by tequila. Relieved, Brian put down the dinette chair. Moving to the dog, Amy fished a red collar and a rolled-up leash from another pocket. She clipped the leash to the collar and put the collar on the dog. Nice doing business with you, sir. While Carl was conducting a second count of the 2,000, Amy tugged gently on the leash. The dog rose at once and padded out of the kitchen at her side. With her little girl in tow, Janet followed Amy and Nicky into the hallway, and Brian went after them, glancing back because he half expected Carl to find his rage again and pick up the turn. Jimmy, the keening boy, was silent now. He had moved from the hallway in the living room, where he stood at a window in the posture of a prisoner at his cell bars. Leading the dog, Amy went to the boy. She stooped beside him and spoke to him. Brian couldn't hear what she said. Their front door was open as he had left it. With the dog prancing smartly at her side, Amy soon joined him on the porch. Standing on the threshold, Janet said, "You were amazing. Thank you. I didn't want the kids to see it happen again." Her face was sallow in the yellow light of the porch lamp, and the whites of her eyes had a jaundiced tint. She looked older than her years and tired. "You know, he'll get another dog," Amy said. "Maybe I can prevent that." "Maybe. I can try." "Did you really mean what you said when you first answered the door?" Janet looked away from Amy to study the threshold at her feet and shrugged. Amy reminded her, "You wish that you were me, or anybody, somebody." Janet shook her head. Her voice lowered almost to a murmur. "What you did in there, the money was the least of it. The way you were with him, I can never do that." "Then do what you can." She leaned close to Janet and said something that Brian could not hear. Listening intently, Janet covered her split and swollen lip with her right hand. When Amy finished, she stepped back and Janet met her eyes once more. They stared at each other, and although Janet didn't say a word or even so much as nod, Amy said, "Good. All right." Janet retreated into the house with her daughter. Nikki seemed to know where she was going and moved forward on her leash, leading them off the porch to the expedition. Brian said, "You always carry $2,000. Ever since 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to save a dog if I hadn't had the money on me to buy it. That first one cost me $322. So sometimes to rescue a dog, you have to buy it. Not often, thank goodness." Without command or encouragement, Nikki sprang into the cargo space of the SUV. "Good girl," Amy said, and the dog's plumed tail swished. "That was crazy what you did. It's only money. I mean, letting him put the pry bar to your throat. He wouldn't have used it." "How can you be sure?" "I know his type. He's basically a pussy." "I don't think he's a pussy. He beats up women and dogs." "You're a woman. Not his type. Believe me, sweetie. In a pinch, you'd have whooped his ass in a New York minute." "Hard to whoop a guy's ass after he embeds a tire iron in your skull." Slamming shut the tailgate, she said, "Your skull would have been fine. It's the tire iron that would have been bent. Let's get out of here before he decides he should have held out for $3,000. Flipping open her cell phone, she said, "We're not leaving." "What? Why?" Keying in 3 numbers, she said, "The fun's just getting started." "I don't like that look on your face." "What look is that?" "Reckless abandon." "Reckless is a cute look for me. Don't I look cute?" The 911 operator answered, and Amy said, "I'm on a cell phone. A man here is beating his wife and little boy. He's drunk." She gave the address. Nose to the glass, peering from the dark cargo hold of the SUV, the golden retriever had the blinkless curiosity of a resident of an aquarium bumping against the walls of its world. Amy gave her name to the operator. "He's beaten them before. I'm afraid this time he's going to cripple or kill them." The breeze stirred faster, and the eucalyptus trees tossed their tresses as if winged swarms spiraled through them. Staring at the house, Brian felt chaos coming. He had much hard experience of chaos. He had been born in a tornado. "I'm a family friend," Amy lied in answer to the 911 operator's question. "Hurry." As Amy terminated the call, Brian said, "I thought you took all the steam out of him." "No. But now he's decided that he sold his honor with the dog. He'll blame Janet for that. Come on." She started toward the house, and Brian hurried at her side. "Shouldn't we leave it to the police? They might not get here in time." Vague leaf shadows shuddered on the moon-silvered sidewalk, as if they were 1,000 beetles quivering toward sheltering crevices. "But a situation like this," he said, "we don't know what we're doing." "What we're doing is the right thing. You didn't see the boy's face. His left eye is swollen. His father gave him a bloody nose." An old anger rose in Brian. "What do you want to do, son of a bitch?" Climbing the porch steps, she said, "That's up to him." Janet had left the front door ajar. From the back of the house rose Carl's angry voice and hammering and crystalline shatters of sound and the sweet, desperate singing of a child. At the core of every ordered system, whether a family or a factory, is chaos. But in the whirl of every chaos lies a strange order waiting to be found. Amy pushed open the door. They went inside. Chapter 2. Ceramic salt and pepper shakers, paired dogs, sitting Airedales, quizzical beagles, grinning Goldens, prancing poodles, shepherds, spaniels, terriers, noble Irish wolfhounds, waited in orderly rows on shelves beyond open cabinet doors, and others stood in disorder on a kitchen counter. Shaking, face pale and wet with tears, Janet Brockman moved 2 sheepdogs from the counter to the table. The tire iron swung high as the woman moved, descended as she put the shakers on the table, and barely missed her snatchback hands. Salt and ceramic shrapnel sprayed from the point of impact, then pepper and sharp shards. The double crack of iron on wood was followed by Carl's demand, 2 more. Watching from the dark hallway, Amy Redwing sensed that the collection must be precious to Janet, the one example of order in her disordered life. In those small ceramic dogs, the woman found some kind of hope. Carl apparently understood this too. He intended to shatter both the figurines and his wife's remaining spirit. Clutching a ragged pink rabbit that might have been a dog toy, the little girl sheltered beside the refrigerator. Her jewel-bright eyes were focused on a landscape of the mind. In a small but clear voice, she sang in a language that Amy did not recognize. The haunting melody sounded Celtic. The boy, Jimmy, evidently had taken refuge elsewhere. Alert to the fact that her husband would as soon shatter her fingers as break the salt and pepper shakers, Janet flinched at the whoosh of an arcing iron. She dropped a pair of ceramic Dalmatians on the table. Crying out as the weapon grazed her right wrist, she cowered back against the ovens, arms crossed over her breasts. When the lug wrench rang off oak, sparing both the salt and pepper, Carl snatched up a Dalmatian and threw it at his wife's face. The figurine ricocheted off her forehead, cracked against an oven door, and fell dismembered to the floor. Amy stepped into the kitchen, and Brian pushed past her, saying, "Leave her alone, Carl." The drunkard's head turned with a crocodilian madness, eyes cold with a cruelty as old as time. Amy had the feeling that something more than the man himself lived in Brockman's body, as though he had opened a door to a night visitor that made of his heart a lair. "Is she your wife now?" Carl asked Brian. "Is this your house? My Teresa there, is she your daughter now?" The sweet song rose from the girl, her voice as clear as the air and as strange as her eyes, but mysterious in its clarity and tender in its strangeness. "It's your house, Carl," said Brian. "Everything is yours, so why smash any of it?" Carl started to speak, but then sighed wearily. The tide of foul emotion seemed to recede in him, leaving his face as smooth as washed sand. Without the anger he had shown previously, he said, "See, the way things are, nothing's better than smashing." Taking a step toward the table that separated them, Brian said, "The way things are. Help me understand the way things are." The hooded eyes looked sleepy, but the reptilian mind behind them might be a crawl with calculation. "Wrong," Carl said. "Things are all wrong." "What things?" His voice swam up from fathoms of melancholy. You wake in the middle of the night when it's blind dark and quiet enough to think for once, and you can feel that how wrong it all is and no way ever to make it right, no way ever. As clear and silvery as the music of Aeolian pipes in an Irish band, Teresa's small voice raised the hairs on the nape of Amy's neck, because whatever the girl's words meant, they conveyed a sense of longing and loss. Brockman looked at his daughter. His sudden tears might have been for the girl, or for the song, or for himself. Perhaps the child's voice had a premonitory quality, Or perhaps Amy's instincts had been enriched by the companionship of so many dogs. She was suddenly certain that Carl's rage had not abated, and that concealed its swell toward violent expression. She knew the iron would swing without warning and take the broken wife in the face, breaking her twice and forever, shattering the hidden skull into the living brain. As if premonition were a wave as real as light, it seemed to travel from Amy to Brian. Even as she inhaled to cry out, he moved. He didn't have time to circle the kitchen. Instead, he scrambled from floor to chair to table. A tear fell to the hand that held the iron, and the fingers tightened on the weapon. "Don't think to shoot, Kristen." Janet's eyes widened, but Carl had drowned her spirit. She stood motionless, breathless, defenseless under a suffocating weight of despair. As Brian climbed toward confrontation, Amy realized that the bludgeon might as likely be flung at the child as swung at the wife, and she moved toward Teresa. Atop the table, Brian seized the weapon as it ascended to strike a blow at Janet, and he fell upon Brockman. They sprawled on the floor into broken pieces of glass and slices of lime and puddles of tequila. Amy had left the front door open, and from the farther end of the house came a voice, "Police!" They had arrived without sirens. "Back here," she called, gathering Teresa to her as the girl's song murmured to a whisper, whispered into silence. Janet stood rigid as if the blow might yet come, but Brian rose in possession of the tire iron. Braided leather gun belts creaking, hands on the grips of their holstered pistols, two policemen entered the kitchen, solid men and alert. One told Brian to put down the tire iron, and Brian placed it on the table. Carl Brockman clambered to his feet, left hand bleeding from a shard of embedded bottle glass. Once burning bright with anger, his tear-streaked face had paled to ashes, and his mouth had gone soft with self-pity. "Help me, Jan," he pleaded, reaching out to her with his bloody hand. "What am I gonna do now? Baby, help me." She took a step toward him, but halted. She glanced at Amy, then at Teresa. With her thumb, the child had corked her song inside, and she had closed her eyes. Throughout these events, her face had remained expressionless, as though she might be deaf to all the threats of violence and to the crash of iron on oak. The only indication that the girl had any connection to reality was the fierceness of her grip on Amy's hand. "He's my husband," Janet told the police. "He hit me." She put a hand to her mouth, but then lowered it. "My husband hit me." "Oh, Jan, please don't do this. He hit our little boy, bloodied his nose, our Jimmy." One of the officers took the tire iron off the table, propped it in a corner beyond easy reach, and instructed Carl to sit in a dinette chair. Now came questions and inadequate answers, and gradually a new kind of awfulness. The recognition of lost promise and the bitter cost of vows not kept. After Amy had told her story to the police, and while the others told theirs, she led Teresa out of the kitchen, along the hallway, seeking the boy. He might have been anywhere in the house, but she was drawn to the open front door. The porch smelled of the night-blooming jasmine that braided through the white laths of the trellis. Laths? I've never heard of that word. Laths. She had not detected the scent earlier. The breeze had died. In the stillness, the eucalyptus trees stood as grim as mourners. Past the dark patrol car at the curb, in the middle of the moon-washed street, boy and dog seemed to be at play. The tailgate of the expedition was open. The boy must have let Nicky out of the SUV. On second look, Amy realized that Jimmy was not playing a game with the retriever, that instead he was trying to run away. The dog blocked him, thwarted him, strove to herd him back to the house. The boy fell to the pavement and stayed where he dropped, on his side. He drew his knees up in the fetal position. The dog lay next to him as though keeping a watch over him. Settling Teresa on a porch step, Amy said, "Don't move, honey, all right? Don't move." The girl did not reply, and perhaps was not capable of replying. Through a night as quiet as an abandoned church, breathing eucalyptic incense, Amy hurried into the street. Nikki watched her as she approached. Under the moon, the golden looked silver, and all the light of that high lamp seemed to be given to her, leaving everything else in the night to be brightened only by her reflection. Kneeling beside Jimmy, Amy heard him weeping. She put a hand on his shoulder, and he did not flinch from her touch. She and the dog regarded each other across the grieving boy. The retriever's face was noble, with, at this moment, none of the comic expression of which the breed was so capable, noble and solemn. All the houses but one remained dark, and the silence of the stars filled the street, disturbed only by the boy's softly expressed anguish, which grew quiet as Amy smoothed his hair. "Nicky," she whispered. The dog did not raise its ears or cock its head, or in any way respond, but it stared at her and stared. After a while, Amy encouraged the boy to sit up. "Put your arms around my neck, sweetheart." Jimmy was small, and she scooped him off the pavement, carrying him in the cradle of her arms. "Never again, sweetheart. That's all over." The dog led the way to the expedition, ran the last few steps, and sprang through the open tailgate. While Amy deposited the boy in the back seat, Nikki watched from the cargo space. "Never again," Amy said, and kissed the boy on the forehead. "I promise you, honey." The promise surprised and daunted her. This boy was not hers, and the arcs of their lives likely would have only this intersection and a short parallel course. She could not do for a stranger's child what she could do for dogs, and sometimes she could not even save the dogs. Yet she heard herself repeat, "I promise." She closed the door and stood for a moment at the back of the SUV, shivering in the mild September night, watching Teresa on the front porch steps. The moon painted faux ice on the concrete driveway and faux frost on the eucalyptus leaves. Amy remembered a winter night with blood upon the snow, and a turbulence of seagulls thrashing into flight from the eaves of the high catwalk, white wings briefly dazzling as they oared skyward through the sweeping beam of the lighthouse, like an honor guard of angels escorting home a sinless soul.